RTE1, Lloyd George awaited a fateful decision by these men. Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith and the rest of the Irish negotiating team were bitterly divided on whether to sign the treaty. In the early hours of December the 6th, they signed. Those who had prayed for their success had hoped for more than the pragmatic compromise offered by Lloyd George. Back in Ireland, it divided the cabinet, the parliament and the country, which within months was involved in a civil war. The treaty has largely determined Irish politics since, south and north. Good evening. In Making History tonight, we ask, was the 1921 agreement a solution or a mere ad hoc settlement of the Irish question? What has its impact been on Ireland since, south and north, and on Anglo-Irish relations? Why is there still such controversy surrounding it? And will such controversy be diminished or increased by the 2-hour television drama, The Treaty, broadcast earlier tonight? I'm joined by 4 historians. We've all been watching that film. Senator John A. Murphy, until recently Professor of Irish History at University College Cork. John Grigg, biographer of Lloyd George. Mary Daly, lecturer in history at UCD. And David Harkness, Professor of Irish History at Queen's University, Belfast. First responses to the television drama. John A. Murphy.
Well, minor quibbles apart, and I suppose we'd all have those. I thought it was a very brave effort indeed, combining entertainment value with historical authenticity, high historic drama, in fact. And I thought it ended on a powerful note. And it wasn't afraid either to put what would nowadays be fairly remote issues, like the issue of allegiance to the Crown, membership of the Commonwealth and so on, which in 1991 make little meaning to most people. The producers weren't a bit afraid to introduce these in their historical context, and I think that was a great bonus. All in all, I think a very good treatment.
John Grigg?
I thought so too. I thought it was a very dramatic presentation, and in spite of the extreme complexity of the episode itself, it came across clearly. The central issues were brought out clearly, and I thought the casting was very strong, particularly on the Irish side.
Yeah. Mary?
Yes, I would agree. Again, I think it's not an issue that immediately lends itself to television, and they did it extremely well without in any sense trivializing what was involved.
But surely it does lend itself to television. There was drama there too.
Oh, in terms of the drama, yes, but I'm thinking in terms of getting across issues such as external association. That's not the stuff of a great television program, but they handled it with, I think, considerable skill.
David Harkness, do you think those who haven't read the books but who've seen that 2 hours will have caught the essential essence of the issues involved?
It's very difficult to ask a group of people who are very well informed on these matters how the uninformed will react. I was looking at it to see whether it was good history. I found it very difficult to tell whether it was good television. But I think I agree with what John has said. I think it was well conveyed, the drama, the importance of the events well put over. And I think from my own point of view, I'd like to add, I thought the characterization was very good. I thought most of the individuals came over as I would have expected them to be put over. 1 or 2 exceptions, and I'd expect John Grigg to be disappointed in Lloyd George, for example, and indeed perhaps the British team altogether.
John Grigg, yeah, sorry?
No, I did. There were 1 or 2 inexplicable lapses into bad taste. That street scene, for example, was low-grade O'Casey, I feel, with people dancing and singing in the streets and so on. And this is something I've been dying to ask John Grigg since he's the expert in Lloyd George. Lloyd George singing badly, I mean, badly, Molly Malone.
I'm sure he had a better voice than that.
Is there any historical evidence?
But he liked singing Welsh hymns better, but I think he would have liked singing Molly Malone, he would have sung a bit better.
And of course, Michael Collins' fiancée, with whom he conducted a regular correspondence during all that period, as is evidenced in Leon O'Brien's book,
was absent.
Kitty Kiernan was conjured out of existence totally.
Yeah. As was your father, Edward Grigg,
yes,
who had a part to play.
That. He came in his words came in, because the words that were uttered by King George V were written by him. Those were his words. So he came in that way. He didn't come in visually.
Right. But overall, what of the characterization of Lloyd George, and let's get down now to the substance of the treaty itself.
Well, I thought it was not bad, but just not brilliant, the characterization of Lloyd George. The liveliness of the man, the vitality of the man was rather lacking. He just wasn't quite sparky enough. But I thought the programme as a whole went some way towards doing justice to Lloyd George and correcting the sort of really massive misrepresentation of Lloyd George about the treaty, which there has been. Because he has been really enormously criticised, even vilified,
well,
for his role in the treaty.
view in Ireland is that he was a negotiating genius, but also an expert in duplicity.
That's right. I mean, the view is he's a trickster.
Wizard.
A trickster without any convictions of his own, who lured these innocent Irishmen into a trap, and as a result, it plunged Ireland into a civil war and partitioned Ireland. I think it's absolute fantasy. He didn't create the divisions of Ireland. The divisions were there.
Yes, but on the other hand, surely he was given to the short-term view.
No, I don't think he was. I think it's not
that business about the Boundary Commission, wasn't that an attempt simply to...
No, well, I'd come back to that, but Churchill made a very good remark about him once. It's in the World Crisis. He said he was capable of living intensely in the present without taking short views. In other words, he had a long view, but he could live intensely in the present and deal with problems of the present. If it hadn't been for the Boundary Commission, surely there would have been no treaty. I mean, he wanted a treaty. He wanted an agreement. How are you going to deal with the North? It could only be dealt with through this device. And of course, he stressed the strengths of it from the Unionist point of view to the Unionists and from the Sinn Féin point of view to the Sinn Féiners. That's diplomacy. That's not duplicity. That's diplomacy.
But wasn't he head and shoulders, as a negotiator, above the others on either side?
He was very experienced. He was a very good negotiator. He certainly was. He'd always been an extremely good negotiator. One of his advantages as a negotiator was he actually listened, as well as being a very good talker. He was a very good listener. He actually listened to what people said and was interested in other people, which is a great strength in negotiation. But in this case, I mean, the idea that he was negotiating in bad faith, which has been really very widely peddled, is, I think, quite unjust. He was negotiating in perfectly good faith, and he got the best possible treaty that he could in the interests not only of his own country, but of Ireland.
David Harkness,
it wasn't his fault that things went wrong.
Right. David, what would your view be on that?
I would accept, I think, the authoritative statement of the best biographer of Lloyd George. But you can call it duplicity or diplomacy, and maybe there's a tendency to go to the diplomacy end of the spectrum from John's point of view. And of course there was an element of trickery, of scene setting. I mean, it was made quite clear, and we know that he tried to overawe de Valera when they first met by painting most of the room red, as it were, the map of the world red, and to imbue him with a sense of the wonderment of the British Empire. And clearly at the end, the devices of waving envelopes about, I don't think that was well done. I think it was overacted. But still, it was part of the magic that the man could weave. And I think it's very hard to condemn an actor for not being able to be the Welsh wizard. I mean, he doesn't, the wizardry isn't very common.
Hadn't he already in 1916 told the Unionists one thing? After 1916, when he was trying to effect an immediate settlement, he suggested that excluding Ulster would be a permanent business to the Unionists, but to Redmond and Nationalists, he suggested it would only be temporary. Wasn't that duplicity?
Beware the heels of a horse, what is it, the tooth of a hound and the tongue of a Welshman in this regard, usually an
John Gray.
Well, I think 1916 is his worst hour in his dealings with Ireland, personally. I mean, I think if you're going to put the finger on Lloyd George in his dealings with Ireland, 1916 was his bad thing. He negotiated a treaty, a settlement. It wasn't a treaty. He negotiated a settlement after the Rising, and he did not push it through. He and Asquith was Prime Minister at the time. He was not. But the two of them failed to push that agreement through, which they should have done. And I think that was his biggest failure. And one of the reasons why they failed was they delayed. Instead of striking quickly, when the thing had been negotiated, striking quickly and getting the thing through, they delayed, and Unionist backbench opinion was able to build up and wreck the thing. And I think he had that very much in mind in 21. He was not going to delay again.
Mary Daly, had he not mesmerised, hypnotised the delegation? They'd forgotten about Dublin by this night, 70 years ago, hadn't they?
Well, in a sense, I'm not so sure that they didn't realise that they had to get an agreement.
Absolutely, I agree
And he gave them an out. And my own feeling about it is he probably pulled tricks. And this business of getting Griffiths to sign undertakings and hiding the letter away conveniently until the opportune moment. But at the same time, they had to be, I mean, de Valera talks about the straitjacket of the Republic. They were all in a straitjacket, and somebody had to extricate them. And the way I always teach it is, okay, some very sharp practices were engaged in, but something had to be done to bring a resolution, and if that's the way it was done, well, so be it.
And was he bluffing at the end, do you think? When he held the 2 letters up and so on.
Well, heaven knows what was in the letters, but in the sense of would they have gone to war again, my own feeling is yeah, maybe not within 2 days, but my own feeling is yes. I mean, they still have all the British troops in Ireland. They have used the period of the truce to get a better sense of where things were. Number of troops in Ireland were at their peak, I mean, much higher than they've been for the 2 previous years when the truce is carried out, when the truce is called. And I think the best evidence that they would have done something to deal with the Irish threat comes if you look at the evidence for the spring of 1922, when you almost get this replay of the treaty in terms of drafting the Constitution, and the Irish are back trying to extricate themselves from the Crown et al. Again. And there is a contingency plan drawn up at that stage that they were going to blockade Ireland, they were going to seize Dublin, they were going to seize Cove and various other places, they were going to seal the border. And that's at a stage when a lot of their troops are already gone, so they can't do as total job. So I've no doubt they would have come back in and fought. They were in a position to fight much more than they had been in 1919, 1920. Their troops are reorganised, and a lot of the pressures which they were under while the War of Independence initially broke out have eased.
But what about English liberal opinion?
George himself might well have fallen, and that might have been better. It might have been better for him if he hadn't got the treaty, if the treaty had failed, and he'd resigned in protest against the incoming Conservative government. It might have saved his career, whereas good opinions, there's at least one very good opinion, that of H.A.L. Fisher, the historian who was a colleague of his at the time. It was the treaty that really destroyed it. The fact that he never came back was due to that.
John A. Murphy?
But to have been, the question you put to Mary is a very difficult one to answer. Would they have gone to war again? There is the fact that the forces of public opinion, both in Britain and in the United States, which were quite instrumental in driving the British to the negotiating table in the first place. Public opinion was still very strong in that regard, and I think any British government would have to have a due regard to public opinion in what it was going to do after the treaty, if the treaty had been rejected.
But in a sense, I think the Irish nationalists were aware of public opinion as well. I mean, this is where you get this break on Ulster rather than break on the Crown, because the feeling was that it wouldn't wash very well internationally to be seen to reject an agreement on grounds largely of symbolism.
That's right. Once
to break
the
on
Irish,
Ulster, to break on partition,
Ulster, yeah, that was seen as an issue that they could sell.
But in any case, once the Irish had accepted an invitation to go to London, then subtly, I think, the onus was on the Irish to make a deal, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
That was Michael Collins' point, wasn't it? That it was accepting the invitation was the compromise.
Yes, yes. And in that regard, John, it seems to me that one of the more significant things about the documentary, with which I think historians would probably agree, is the poor light in which de Valera is shown. When I say historians would agree, I would think that most historians would see that period as his bad time, as it were.
Yeah.
So why did he not go to London, in your view?
Well, I think it was partly caution, partly the certain knowledge that compromise was inevitable. After all, the external association proposition was compromise. And I think none of the reasons put forward by his apologists really stand up. I think none of them were against the crucial fact that, as W.T. Cosgrave said, he was their best player.
And why keep the best player at home? Yeah. David Harkness?
Well, I was just wondering whether he might not have wished to come in to untie the knot at the last stage. I agree with John on all that he said, and he was the president, and presidents maybe shouldn't negotiate and compromise. But
Lloyd,
he had already negotiated.
President Mitterrand, President Bush.
Well, yes, but where he is the head of state at this time.
But he was also head of government. I mean,
it was both. It was more a French or an American parallel.
Yes, but he had an argument, okay, for not compromising the Republic, and he voiced it. But I wonder whether part of his chagrin at the end was, after all, he said, well, I don't think there's any reason for me to come over at present. And it's added in the minutes that it was decided he would not come over at present, which might indicate that he might come in later when...
I think
we're talking now about December the 3rd, aren't we?
Oh, yes,
just before the treaty was signed. There was a cabinet meeting in Dublin.
So then...
whether he would then go.
Despite the fact that the delegates had gone back saying, well, we're not going to sign, they actually sign, and they remove the opportunity that he might have had to come and say, well, now, this is the grand gesture. We've got so far. You can't agree. Why don't you do this in the name of peace or something like that?
I suppose most people would be speculating as to what difference it would have made if he had gone in the first place and had headed a delegation from the outset. I don't think it would have made any great substantial difference in terms of the deal that was given. Perhaps there would have been some improvement here and there.
But surely in terms of selling it back home.
Well, absolutely. It would have made a huge difference if De Valera and Collins had unitedly recommended.
But yes,
But wasn't he also concerned with the faction, the Brewer faction in the cabinet, that he needed to bring them along?
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, that was very much in his mind, isn't it? With a lot of hindsight that we're criticising him.
Oh, I mean, you can sense the problem with the Brewer faction, but on the other hand, there was no really serious political leader in that faction who could have carried a mass of people with them. I mean, there would have been.
They didn't need a mass of people, but they would have.
Yeah, but there would have been dissent, and there would have been
treaty in
division.
arms, possibly. That's what he believed.
But in terms of the numbers game, it would have been a weaker anti-treaty side.
And isn't it true to say, I mean, this is not, you know more about this than I do, but isn't it true to say that even though he converted Brewer and Stack to external association, those two individuals, he certainly didn't convert the people they represented.
That's right.
And people like Mellows and O'Connor were not converted at all. So there was going to be a split anyway.
Yes, but on whether he should have gone later, the latest historian to comment on this is Nicholas Manser, indeed in his last book. And he makes the point, somewhat sympathetically to De Valera, but the terms may not bring that much comfort to him. He says, a prince, Machiavelli after all advised, should not enter into negotiations in which his emissaries have already failed to achieve his aims. So is there a sense in which De Valera, from the July meetings with Lloyd George, knew that he wasn't going to make headway? After all, the very chemistry between the two of them, John Greig, hadn't been good, had it?
No,
well,
very
I
bad.
do think that's important, because I don't think that they would have got substantially the same. I think it would have broken earlier. I don't think that he would have shared with Collins the same preparedness to settle for the best they could get for Ireland, even though he used those words. I think that that would have broken earlier, and there wouldn't, these two men, Griffiths and Collins, who worked so sympathetically together and got something which they felt was a stepping stone to greater things. I don't think it would have got to that point.
So they were more pragmatic.
Yes.
De Valera, while being quite pragmatic in a lot of things, was also very pedantic in negotiation,
Yes,
wasn't he?
yes.
But John, what's your view of the relationship, the chemistry between Lloyd George and De Valera as of the July meetings?
It was very bad. I mean, Lloyd George expected to be very impressed by De Valera. He would have been impressed by the idea of De Valera. And when De Valera came back from America, he felt, that a lot of other people in Britain felt, that this is a great opportunity. He's the moderate man we can deal with. But when he met him, he was disappointed by him and found him pedantic, funny, couldn't pin him down to any point, couldn't make him see things in a rational way, because they were different sorts of nationalists, that's true. They were fundamentally different. Lloyd George was a passionate Celtic nationalist, but he didn't think that you had to be separate in order to have national identity. He felt that his Welsh national identity was even stronger as part of the United Kingdom, part of the British Empire. That actually, as long as the Welsh could be completely equal within the United Kingdom and within the Empire, then their identity was stronger rather than weaker. To that was absolute taboo to De Valera, that whole conception. They couldn't get on. I think they were made not to get on, those two men.
De Valera, John A. Murphy, was preoccupied in his afterlife, wasn't he, about the fact that he hadn't gone, and he excused it and he explained it interminably in a way. In one letter to Lord Longford, of course, his biographer, he said that being at home would allow him to subject any document to legal scrutiny, and the flaw in the boundary clause, for instance, might have been seen had it been brought back. Do you think there's any merit in any of these arguments?
I don't really, because on the question of the boundary clause, on the whole question of Ulster, surely De Valera at the negotiating table would have, because he was so much more astute in all these matters, he would have secured a better deal on the Boundary Commission. Now, again, I don't know where that would have led, but surely he would have asked for an international monitoring team.
I may be making a pedantic point, but in a sense he accepted the Boundary Commission in document number 2.
Yes, that's right.
The ambiguity is essential. I mean, the ambiguity is essential to the whole acceptance.
Somebody has said, John, that De Valera didn't go because he knew compromise was inevitable, and he rejected the treaty because it wasn't his compromise. And indeed, that strikes me very forcefully, because Henry Grattan said back in 1783 that Henry Flood was against the settlement made at that time, because it wasn't Flood who had made it. Yeah. And we may well surmise that Charlie Haughey
There's been recent comments
didn't
of a similar nature.
accept the Anglo-Irish agreement because it wasn't he who had made the deal. So I do think there's an irreducible dimension there of vanity and unwillingness to be involved in something he knew was going to be messy.
So we're dealing, after all, at the end of the day, with individuals, very strong characters on both sides, aren't we? Extraordinary people, really, at that junction in history. What about the whole question, though, of Ulster as the stumbling block? Lloyd George's perception of the Ulster difficulty, he was more realistic about that.
I think he always had been. I mean, even from before the war, when the Third Home Rule Bill was coming forward, he felt you couldn't coerce the Ulster Unionists into a Home Rule Ireland. And he and Churchill, actually, were the two members of the Asquith Cabinet who said you must have opting-out clauses in the bill as drafted. He was the only, they were the only two who took that view. He was sure you couldn't coerce Ulster Unionists, but he wanted them to come in. He wanted a united Ireland. It's quite unfair to Lloyd George to suggest that he wanted to divide Ireland.
But did he,
Not at all.
Did he think he could buy them, which was the suggestion in this?
Well, I think he underrated, I think he was more realistic about Ulster Unionists than Irish nationalists were. But I think he was less than realistic in that respect.
Yes.
I don't think he could have forced them in, but he certainly hoped he would be able to. I think he hoped that by the combined force of the Boundary Commission and fiscal autonomy in the South, acting as an economic magnet, that he would induce the Northern Unionists to go into a Dominion state as Ireland, as it was then going to be. I'm sure that was his sincere desire, and it wasn't his fault that there was a civil war, and that the whole Boundary Commission thing was blighted, and anyway implemented by a different government after he'd fallen from power.
In short, he wanted to keep Ireland subordinate but not divided.
Well, I don't think subordinate. I mean, except in the purely physical sense that obviously Ireland is a smaller country than Britain. But Wales...
Well, in terms of naval defence, for instance.
Wales is smaller than England, but he wanted Welshmen to be equal with Englishmen. He wanted Irishmen to be equal.
Yes, but he wanted everything to be subordinated to British security and strategic
He believed
interests.
in the British Empire, certainly, but he wanted the Irish to be part of the managing team of the British Empire. He was an imperialist. There's no question about that. No nonsense about it.
What about the Ulster Unionists and their perception of this whole process? Because they were rather unhappy about all of this, weren't they?
They never thought it would happen. I didn't really believe the British government could do a deal with these people whom they'd been denouncing so vigorously. They rejoiced in the breakdown in July. They couldn't believe that come October they were actually going to sit down and negotiate with them. They were extremely hostile as the picture began to clarify that a settlement that had been final the previous year was now going to be overturned. They were very resentful of pressures put on them, this financial pressure, lower taxes, the exchange of correspondence between the two. And at the end of the day, they got no comfort at all from the divisions that were apparent between, as they saw, the here and now Republicans of De Valera and the by and by Republicans of Griffith and Collins. Equally, they were anathema, and they wished to keep their own part of their own established territory free from all this.
And the siege mentality set in. It was there anyway, but it was reinforced by all of this.
Indeed, and of course
by the Civil War after.
The misgivings that they'd had about London, which are evident in their acceptance of the 1920 settlement, are multiplied.
But surely the Civil War consolidates their position immeasurably by delaying resolution of the Boundary Commission and by changing the whole focus of Irish politics from a north-south issue to an internal.
And I think I should just mention that in May 1921, Craig did go to see Dev.
The one and only meeting.
That's right. He entrusted himself to an IRA escort in Dublin and went and saw Dev, who was hiding at that time, wasn't he? He was still in trouble.
Yes. Yeah.
And he got a brush off really from Dev.
Well, he got a history lecture.
He got a very history lecture.
Yes.
And
Brian Brew after 4 hours. They reached Brian Brew after about 4 hours. Not quite, but that was the jest. Yes.
And it was a tragic missed opportunity there, because I mean, supposing those two men had been able to talk serious, realistic politics, I mean, things might have worked out differently.
But Craig and Cosgrave got on all right, but
yes, exactly.
There was some civil war in Ireland, a danger anyway, in 1921, and whether it was going to be a north-south one or internally within the south. What about that, Mary?
Oh, I'm fairly confident of that. You have unleashed so many disparate forces that it's very difficult to get everything back under control once a war situation ends. And if you look at the whole record for the first 6 months of 1922 in terms of the northern issue, I mean, it was obviously a very dangerous, very unstable game that was being played and quite obviously if there hadn't been some kind of internal civil war, the possibility of a north-south conflict, north-south civil war, or maybe, as Collins tried to do, in fact, to direct the irregulars, the anti-treaty forces, to that particular conflict was a very real possibility, I think.
John A. Murphy, what's your view there of Collins and how he handled that issue?
Well, as Mary was saying, I think some kind of conflict was inevitable. After all, what the documentary didn't quite bring out, I suppose you wouldn't expect it to bring it out, was that the whole Sinn Féin movement was a common front comprising a wide variety of ideological opinions, and that when the British pressure lifted, if you like, the pressure of British military repression lifted, the front tried to, or tended to fall apart. What we're looking at also, I think, is the conflict between the military men, and I think Collins was in that end of the spectrum.
The IRB connection, for instance.
Yes.
Checking it with the IRB all the time.
Yes, and I'm also thinking of those who were implacable military men like Rory O'Connor and so on the one hand, and the politicians on the other. And the conflict between those who realized some kind of compromise was inevitable and those who didn't see themselves at all as politicians, who despised politicians like Cathal Brewin and Mary Maxwell and so on, and who saw their function. And this is why they didn't trust Lloyd George, because he was in their folklore the politician supreme. But they saw themselves as custodians of the Republic, already existing and mystical and not to be betrayed. Yeah. And that was a powerful thing. It's
from that school that you get the whole version of the treaty, the whole scenario of people like Collins corrupted by the London experience, and this comes in the flesh pots exactly, and all these weird allegations in the treaty debates about marriage to Princess Mary, which is all evidence of an acute paranoia that had hit the country by early 1922.
What of the impact of the treaty afterwards, Mary Daly? It really gave De Valera his agenda, didn't it? It gave him the material with which to found Fianna Fáil and give it its policies for the first 15 years.
Well, certainly up to 1938, both parties, in truth, are working within the treaty parameter. And I don't think
working to subvert it,
to unravel it, yes. And I think one mistake we all make is just because Commonweal is the pro-treaty side, there is a tendency to box them in as loving every clause in that treaty, which is very unfair. I mean, they are working to unravel it. They're not as strident as Fianna Fáil are, but there's no great evidence that they've any great love for the clauses that are in it. And they go a long way down the road, in fact, with up to the Statute of Westminster in 1931, and De Valera is the beneficiary of it.
Yes. David Harkness, you're the expert on all of this.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I would certainly agree. I think it would be most unfair to... They were condemned to work within the treaty. They had to do things bilaterally. Later, De Valera could do them unilaterally, but only because they had achieved so much and had virtually reached the full independence that they had sought.
They gave him his platform in the League of Nations,
yes,
Statute of Westminster.
The Statute of Westminster, and clarifying even minor existing anomalies by the time De Valera took power in 1932. And as he said himself, he was astonished at the degree to which he had freedom to manoeuvre.
The status of Canada as a dominion was indeed cited in the very treaty itself, John A. Murphy. That hasn't been really sufficiently appreciated.
No, that was the model. Canada was to be the exemplar. But of course, Irish nationalists, Irish Republicans distrusted this exemplar in that they could point out that Canada was a huge country, 3,000 miles away. It was part of the British family, as it were. Someone pointed out that it was wrong to say to the Irish, yes, you can be a nation like Canada, when the Irish wanted to be a nation like Poland. And so, from the very beginning, and this is one of the great might have beens, I feel, of the whole drama, from the very beginning there was no inclination on the part either, indeed, of the pro or anti-treaty people to become really interested in the Commonwealth dimension and the possibilities of the Commonwealth.
I mean,
he had
well briefed during the negotiations by Duncan Hall. He had something of a vision of the Commonwealth.
Only
wanted to bring America in, of course, but you know, he had a sense of, even then, and others required it, of the value of having colleagues in a very troubled world. I mean, it was a very troubled world. Let's not forget, very uncertain.
There was never, David, a Commonwealth party.
No, there were no votes
in the Ireland of the 20s and 1930s. And the whole unfinished business, to which Mary referred to, going up to 1938, was Anglo-Irish unfinished business. The Commonwealth was an alien dimension imposed on that. And I think in 1921 that they didn't realise that indeed the Commonwealth was already an association of independent nations.
And indeed that secession was part of the equation.
Indeed.
As was shown later.
I feel that it was a pity, perhaps, that Ireland didn't have that wider context in which to live in the world, you know.
It's possible. We can never know.
Europe is supplying it now to some extent.
It's possible that Collins might have developed that way. It's
possible.
possible.
It's not to try to educate the Valera on
Though there were
Very much
signs
so,
that he was
yeah.
going back to his
Very
Republican.
Absolutely. I mean, I mean, in the De Valera papers, you can see quite a number of files. Morris Moore was out in South Africa, and you can see interesting stuff back sent by Smuts saying that yes, they had signed the Versailles Treaty as an independent nation, and major emphasis on South African autonomy vis-a-vis Britain.
The British later
1921.
tried to produce an argument that what Ireland had been given was the status of Canada on the 6th of December 1921 and no more. And
no
I mean,
more,
that
yes.
argument didn't last
But
long.
it's interesting that in the treaty debates themselves, again, most of the deputies didn't really refer to Canada very much. In fact, Austin Stack, that duo Republican from Kerry, said, I don't want half Canadian powers or three-quarter Canadian powers or full Canadian powers. I want an independent Ireland. And David Kent from East Cork said that there were so many quick change artists he'd listened to in the last few days that he didn't know whether it was in Canada or in Ireland he was standing. But it's interesting, though, that many of the deputies referred to South Africa as a Commonwealth country with which they could more readily identify because of the nationalist links.
Had done that anyway.
Yeah.
But what if the treaty had not been signed just 70 years ago? Can we put the question that way? Are we saying that essentially some pragmatic compromise would have had to happen in the next couple of years, and that it might have been a crude compromise, unsatisfactory to different factions, but that it was actually inevitable? Is that what we're saying?
I think what we have to remember there is the spectacular advance, if you like, that was offered in the refined Dominion status that was finally put on the table. Now, leaving Ulster aside, and that's a different matter. But that offer, compared with what had been an offer, let us say, from 1912 onwards, you know, that was really, I think, as spectacular an advance as the British could have made at that stage. An external association, though very far-sighted and astute proposal, and one, in fact, which became part of the whole Commonwealth,
India
in later years, was, however, in 1921, I think, too far advanced for the British to concede.
You mentioned India, John. It's quite interesting that even nearly 30 years later, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a thoroughgoing nationalist, if you ever had one, and a really passionate one, that he agreed to Dominion status as a first stage, nearly 30 years later, as a first stage to pressing the claim to a republic. He did press the claim afterwards.
But the mystique of the crown, which seems so incredible looking back to 1920, and the very notion of a single, not even a several crown, but a single cement for the whole empire, which, 10 years later had become very different, even by, 1931.
But the question we're on, the question we're on is whether some pragmatic compromise was inevitable around that period. It might have been with different. Is that what we're really saying? Because the critics of the treaty say if they hadn't signed it, there might have been a quite different outcome.
I mean, I've no doubt that Ireland probably got as much from Britain as Britain was prepared to yield at that point. And we always see the treaty as a compromise. It was also a massive compromise for Britain. And what's most interesting looking at Anglo-Irish relations for the next 20 years or so is that Britain is all the time being faced with the implications of what it has given Ireland and is trying to pull back from it in all kinds of areas. The whole 30s, the whole De Valera dispute is really Britain swallowing very hard as Ireland is pushing through the implications of its freedom. The same applies, it goes up through neutrality and everything. Ireland has got as far as Britain, further than Britain is really prepared to let it go.
But that is because of the rest of the empire.
Emphatically, yeah. But Ireland pushes it to its logical conclusion,
sure.
the rest of them don't.
But the central thing is that the British, and Churchill typifies this particularly, found it very hard to swallow the notion that Ireland was a nation, which was entitled to independence. That's
even when neutrality came, Churchill, I think in 1939, says, "Era is at war, but skulking."
Yes, he denied Ireland's right to be neutral because he denied Ireland's right to be independent.
Yeah.
So against that background, it seems to me the treaty was a spectacular...
I think if the treaty hadn't been signed, there would have been much greater bloodshed than there was. I think the carnage and the shambles here would have been much greater than they were, and the subsequent, that would have had to be a settlement, would have been a less good one because of the greater bitterness which would have been generated by the carnage. I mean, although it's terrible, the Civil War, the number of casualties actually is not all that great in the Civil War. When you think of other civil wars. And it was not like if it had been a renewed repression, which there would have been, in my opinion, if there hadn't been the treaty. So there had been terrible carnage from that. There might well have been a North-South war. It would have been a frightful mess. I think that it was blessing the treaty occurred.
But your question is, you know, if the treaty hadn't been signed. But I mean, if there hadn't been a truce, if you just shifted back, I mean, really the point at which you take your decision is really quite important.
And John, there's another point we mustn't forget, that although the actual division in the Dáil debates was very narrow, what was it, 60...
64.
57.
That's very misleading, because that does not reflect the division in the country at large.
As was shown in the election shortly after.
Indeed, in the June 22 election, with all its flaws, nonetheless, it amounted to a massive popular endorsement of the treaty. And I think people were very glad to settle for that. And so I think, whatever we think about the treaty, I think it had a very popular backing there.
And can I ask the teaching historians amongst us in Cork, in UCD and in Queen's, what does all of this mean now to the young people coming into your first year lectures? Does the treaty mean much to them? Many of them, of course, are not even...
It does by the time they've studied it, I can tell you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not I mean, from the northern point of view, people are actually anxious to know how we got to where we are now, and they're very ignorant of Irish history and perhaps even of British history. And they do pursue this course with great enthusiasm, and they follow it very closely. And I think they come through chastened and well-informed about this period, and they've certainly regarded it as a milestone, as very important and significant.
And it is very hard not to be moved by the actual treaty debates.
Indeed.
In their blazing sincerity, perhaps at times a bit of theatricality and so on.
And at the end of the day, you know, there's still questions to be asked, and their opinion is as good as anyone else's, because the sources are very accessible, and they can. I mean, they haven't the time as undergraduates to go into great depth, but I think they do take it very seriously.
Mary, what's your view?
I think the main misconception that I've always found is some strange belief that what was on offer in the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, or indeed in earlier Home Rule legislation, is very close to what they got in the treaty. And this is the one that you invariably have to knock. And the other misconception that regularly surfaces, and I must confess I had it until I went to college, was that the split was all over partition. And in other words, the element that has got lost and that is very hard to bring up nowadays is this whole business of the crown, because nobody in this generation can really understand the depth of emotions was associated with this particular symbolism at the time, and that's the one where you have to work with students to push them back into the atmosphere of the time.
Partition was invisible, wasn't it? In the treaty debates, there were just 9 column inches or something.
Absolutely.
Because Griffiths actually believed in the crown, didn't he? He believed in a sort of Austro-Hungarian style dual monarchy.
Of equality.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
In Britain, John, the treaty now? Just history.
I'm afraid so, and I hope this programme will help to revive people's knowledge. Not revive, but actually create people's knowledge of the episode. And again, give them a fair picture of it.
The British reaction to be now? Because they will see it also as part of the current context, won't they?
Well, I hope not, because that would be highly misleading. I mean, I hope they don't see Gerry Adams as being the natural heir and successor of Michael Collins, because I think there's a very fundamental difference there. That there was something like, I agree, rather confused in doing what you say, but there was nevertheless something like democratic sanction for what Michael Collins did. There's no democratic sanction for what the IRA is doing in the North at the moment.
John A. Murphy, on that point?
Yes, on that point, the phrase unfinished business comes to mind. There's still a sense in which the North is unfinished business. I'm hesitating saying that in case it might be taken up in the wrong way, but it is obviously still unfinished business.
But you think this particular programme will broadly be a help?
And I think the programme is very fair. I think that it should be equally acceptable to Irish and British audiences. I think there was a scrupulous attempt to be fair there.
We're all agreed on that?
Oh,
yes, and I think I think it's slightly unfair of you to say that the people, or to imply that people were not interested in unity and that the Dáil debates didn't pay much attention to it. I think a lot of people who looked at the boundary commission clause felt it would deliver the North. And others certainly didn't want to undermine that, because to do so, to talk endlessly about how defective it was to aid your enemy. and jeopardize the goal that you wanted. So don't.
And I think
They also well appreciated the difficulty of delivering, I think, as well.
Yes,
yes, they do now. I'm not sure.
I think a lot of them did then. Look at De Valera in August 21, where he said county option, all of that. Anyway, these are questions perhaps for some other day. My thanks to David Harkness, Mary Daly, John Grigg, and John A. Murphy. And thank you also for joining us tonight, and good night.
RTE and Thames Television have published a 24-page fully illustrated study guide examining the background to the treaty. For your copy, send a cheque or postal order for £1 to The Treaty, P.O. Box 1947, RTE, Dublin 4.
Colin has no common sense. So when he tried...